share my screen.
Yeah.
So, is the screen visible?
Yes, sir. It's visible.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you. So, let me start with the presentation. Right, so today we will be discussing about fault tolerance in distributed systems in general. And this is actually a very vast topic. So, out of all the issues that are present in addressing fault tolerance in distributed systems, we will be taking up one particular issue, and that is about recovery from faults. So all of us know distributed systems have been introduced for multiple reasons. The first reason is that a distributed system can be expanded in a modular fashion. So if we have, let's say today, let's say we build a website with 2 servers, assuming that we have a load of, let's say, around 1,000 requests per minute. And tomorrow, if it increases to, let's say, 10,000 hits per minute, then we can scale up our system from 2 servers to, let's say, 10 servers or more than that. So this modular expandability is essentially the key driver, key motivation for having a distributed system. Compare this vis-a-vis with any other system where this modular expansion is not possible. Okay, where we might have a machine which is extremely powerful, has lots of facilities, but then we have to spend a lot of cost in acquiring that machine, and then it is designed to take up certain load. If the load increases beyond that point, it's not very easy to scale that machine, that particular centralized server. While in a distributed system, it is possible for us to scale. And because there are multiple independent units which are now connected, so there are various issues that need to be handled for distributed systems. So one of the main things is there is no single clock which governs all the systems. So there are issues related to timing, and then those are addressed using techniques like logical clocks proposed by Lamport, or vector clocks and things like that. And there is no global shared memory. So no node has an entire view of the system. And therefore, we need techniques to handle that as well. And most importantly, since the message passing happens only through is the only mode of communication, so there are delays associated with that. And because of the channel characteristics, because the way the networks themselves behave, we need to design algorithms which can tackle various issues that are there with networks. For example, a link might be lossy, a link might deliver messages out of order, or a link might just get crashed or something like that. So we have to design algorithms in a distributed system considering all these issues. And that's the reason why algorithm design is an intricate issue in distributed systems. Having said all this, one of the major motivations of having a distributed system is essentially fault tolerance. It is because that we have multiple systems now which may have identical functionality. We should design algorithms such that even if a few of the nodes in the distributed systems fail, we still be able to provide certain service. Okay, that is one of the major motivations of distributed systems, and that is the reason the way we have to design algorithms is the fact that fault tolerance is always taken into mind, that the systems will fail, the links will crash, nodes will crash, and our algorithms should still function in the presence of these node crashes or link failures. Okay, because one of the reasons is that we build distributed systems using common off-the-shelf machines systems rather than very highly costly integrate systems which we which we interconnect together. So since they are common off the shelf, it's quite likely that they will fail. And because the networks are also pretty standard networks rather than having a very a network with lot of capability. So because of that, the link crashes might also happen. So we may require alternate links and alternate paths and so on. And therefore, this fault tolerance is a key issue in any distributed system. And what we will be discussing in today's lecture is various issues that are associated with fault tolerance. And then we will focus on this issue that is about recovery from faults. So before we do that, let's see what is a fault. How do we characterize a fault? Well, as we know, in a distributed system, there are multiple nodes, multiple components, networks itself. So a fault is a condition which might get which might get introduced into the system because of various factors. One of the factors is there is a manufacturing problem. So some device has started malfunctioning because of an issue that is related to its manufacturing itself. Or there could be design errors. When we talk of a distributed system, it's not just the hardware we should think of. A distributed system constitutes of both hardware and software. So there might be design errors present in the software that is running on some of the nodes, and because of that, a fault gets introduced. Third thing could be there might be external interference, which is something very difficult to handle nowadays. And external interference would be something like a security attack. So let's say one of the nodes of our distributed system is compromised in some way, and a person or a user or a software entity introduces a threat from that particular compromised device, and then because of that a fault has been introduced, and therefore if we are not careful, then something difficult or something impossible to recover from can happen because of such an interference. Or there could be a fatigue. So systems, many of the systems have mechanical parts present, or if they are semiconductor based systems, then maybe there is a problem due to the heat that gets generated, and because of that systems eventually face a fatigue issue, and they start malfunctioning over a period of time. So because of all these factors, we might have faults which might get introduced into the system. But if a fault is introduced, some of the faults actually are those which cause the system to go into an erroneous state. Okay, not all faults might lead us to an erroneous state. Some of the faults might take the system from a well-defined state to a state that is erroneous. For example, a well-defined state of a distributed system might be that only the users who are authenticated are the only ones who would be accessing that particular accessing the system. However, if it is the case that an external person has got an unauthorized access, then a fault has been introduced. However, if the external person who has entered has actually is just looking at whatever is happening inside the system rather than introducing his own messages or killing processes and things like that, that particular fault that has been introduced has not really caused an error. Okay, the system functioning continues to happen the way it was happening before, except that a fault has been introduced and there is something fishy going on. However, the system has never gone from a well-defined state to an erroneous state. The moment this external person introduces a message, kills a process, then the system state has come to an erroneous state. Okay, such a state, it was not supposed to enter, but it entered into that state. If the process that was killed by the external entered person, if the process was not really important for the functioning of the system, still an error has not been caused. It's an erroneous state, but an error has not been caused. An error would be caused if the process that has been killed is actually something that was meaningful for the functioning of the system. And because of that, if error that might be caused, we finally have a failure of the system. So some component of the system stops functioning or starts misbehaving and things like that. And that is what we mean by a failure. So from this slide, we just, a takeaway is that faults keep on happening into systems because of various factors. Some of the faults might take the system to an erroneous state. Some of those erroneous states might actually exhibit an error, and because of that error, there might be a failure of a component of the distributed system. Right. So we need to tackle these issues using techniques or basically having fault tolerance-based algorithms. So what do we mean by fault tolerance? Well, it's the ability of a system to deliver its functioning in spite of faults in its components. So that's the classic definition of fault tolerance. So the system functioning must continue even if some of the components of the system are faulty. So what kind of system services should continue? Well, it could be the full service. So that is, whatever was happening, whatever the system was supposed to deliver, continues to deliver even if there is a fault present in the system. Okay, so the specified behavior in the fault-free state continues to be provided even in the presence of faults. Well, in order to provide this full service functionality, there is a cost associated with this kind of provision. Okay, for example, a thing that is written here, so we could have a primary backup kind of a server system to tolerate one server failure. So let's say we have a server and a primary backup of that server running continuously. Okay, that would mean if a request comes from the external world to the primary server, the same request is actually forwarded to the backup server also, synchronously in time. And whatever state changes happen in the primary server, those same state changes in the same order are also done on the backup server. So therefore, they are made in sync with each other, or what is called as a hot standby. So now if it so happens that because of some fault getting introduced, if the primary server fails, the hot standby server can take up. Okay, in order for it to take up, we obviously want that the network links that were sending messages from the external world to the primary server would now start sending messages to the standby server as well, because the primary server is not functioning. Okay, and then whatever changes that that need to be effected because of these requests from the external world, all of them take place in the secondary server, and the system functioning is not hampered. To the external world, we feel as if nothing has happened. All of us have used various kinds of distributed systems like the Google servers or any video conferencing facility that we are using currently. All of them are huge distributed systems. And this particular facility of having these backup servers is always there. I've heard that if you talk of the Google server farm, they keep the server farms, either on the mountain tops or deep below inside rivers, so that, the heat that is generated by these components is tolerated because of this cooling down, since they are kept inside the rivers or on mountain tops. Therefore, because of, the probability of a fault occurring into the components is kind of reduced. Even in that situation, it's quite likely that multiple servers, typically they are all rack servers, multiple servers keep on failing from time to time. But to the external world, that is to us, the users, we never feel any disturbance because of this fact that there are these hot standbys. Okay, but to maintain a hot standby, there is a cost associated. And what is the cost? Well, of course, hardware is definitely an important component. So, we need to have this extra server with the same functionality. So the cost doubles up. The network links also need to be, alternate links need to be sent to the backup server, so that there is a cost with the network also. And most importantly is the cost of the software that is actually running behind. So the software must be aware that there might be faults which might happen, and because of that there might be failures which might take place in the system. So in the presence of such failures, the software should adapt. So we should have mechanisms where the messages coming from the external world are being sent to both the servers in an atomic fashion, in the same order in which they were received, which is itself a difficult task. And then we also need to ensure that the order in which the computation happens in the primary server, the same order is also present in the replicated server as well. Okay, so that is this mirroring of replicas needs to take place, which also is a difficult problem. And there are algorithms to ensure that this exact synchrony of states between these servers always takes place. Okay, so there are these various software and hardware costs associated with maintaining these backup servers. So if we have such servers, then we can provide full service. What is the second option? The second option is to still provide the service, but with some degraded performance. And that is what is written in the second bullet here. So we have a degraded service. So there is a deviation from the specified behavior in a fault-free state, but in a predefined manner. So the way this deviation from the specification happens is actually known to the external world beforehand. So there are, what we all call as service level agreements, which are signed between the providers and customers. So they say if, this system has an uptime of, let's say, 98%, then, and what happens with the failures if we are there in the 2% cases? Well, in that situation, the system will behave in such and such manner. Okay, that is what we mean by predefined behavior that needs to be specified a priori when the system is actually delivered to the customer. And then there is what kind of degradation might happen. So this is an example that has been written here. So let's say there is a web service with multiple load balance servers in the backend. Okay, so there were, let's say, 10 servers which were servicing some web service. And let's say 3 of them failed. It might happen that we still provide the service that was expected by the external world. However, the service that has been provided now takes little more time because the servers that are active have more load to take into account for the failures of the 3 servers which were already which have crashed in this particular. So therefore, the timing guarantees, which were part of the service level agreements that were signed between the provider and the customer, may not be honored now. Okay, so the system has started giving its response, but with a slower response time, or essentially longer time for servicing a particular request. So the user will feel a difference from the position where it was, everything was fine. There is a difference which the user feels. So the service is kind of degraded. However, a service is still provided. Okay, so that is this fact about deviation from the standard, from the specified behavior is there because of faults that get introduced. Okay, and we see such situations multiple times. And then finally, a third bullet, which I have not even bothered to write out here, is that we could have the entire system crashing. So actually, no service gets provided to the external world. Well, we never want that a system should crash in that particular manner if there are faults present in the system. Such a system, I would say, is very badly designed, or it has happened that so many components of the system have failed that it is just not possible for us to get any service done from that. And urgently, some issues need to be addressed. And we have seen this multiple times. We have seen situations where the servers which a bank provides, it crashes, and then because of that, no operations are possible during a time, and then quickly they want to restore that service once they know what has happened. So if there are many centralized components in systems, then it's quite likely that this kind of situation might happen. So that centralized component crashes. It might be a hardware or a software entity, and if that crashes, the functioning which is supposed to be provided by the entire system just is lost. Even though a lot of other components in the system, both hardware and software, might still be functioning. So the key to fault tolerance or designing fault tolerant systems is to have as less centralized components as possible, because that is a single point of a failure, and because of that, the entire system service might just fail. So that is one of the main design challenges, that how do we avoid having centralized components and still maintain a coherent view of the entire system, given the fact that there are timing guarantees or there are issues related to timing, since the clocks are not synchronized. There is no globally shared memory. Messages might arrive into the system in a different order, and therefore the processing might not be ensured all the time. In spite of all these, how do we ensure that we should have as minimum centralized components as possible? And actually, in practice, it should be zero, no centralized component. Then these systems will continue to provide functioning even in the presence of. Right. So, what do we mean by fault tolerance? So, in order to define what we mean by fault tolerance, we first need to understand what are the different types of faults that might happen in the system. The first thing, that there could be a crash fault. Okay, if one of the components of the system just stops functioning, it halts, which is most often the case. And actually, we would say this is a case which is kind of easier for us to handle. Okay, just a system has just stopped functioning. It might be a hardware or a software entity, so it just halts. Second type of thing is called as fail stop, which is kind of rare to see. It's also a crash fault, but there are some additional things associated with the server or some system that has crashed. So, for example, let's take a situation that a software entity has crashed. So, therefore, it is not just providing any service. So, whatever message we send to that particular software piece of code, a process, there is no response coming from that process. But because of that, if the software was maintaining some data structure, some table in a database, which actually was updated by only this software, and now it is not getting updated, then there is an impact on rest of the functioning of the system. So we could have a fault where it's not just a crash, but there are these additional conditions, that something that was expected by the other parts, other pieces of code, is not being provided because of this particular. Okay, so that is what we mean by fail stop kind of a fault. Third kind of a failure, which is also typically there, is called as the omission failure. Okay, omission failure would mean the entity is providing service at certain points of time and does not provide service in other points of time. It fails responding to a particular message, or in some situations, and it responds in some other situations. Why can this happen? Well, let's consider a situation where messages arriving to a node in a distributed system are actually are entered inside a queue. Well, all of us know that queue is a structure that we implement inside memory, and all nodes have finite size memory available. So with that, what will happen is, if the number of messages has gone beyond the capacity which we have allotted for this queue, or if the processing of the system has slowed down, so therefore lots of messages are left lying into the queue, then what might happen is a new incoming message might not find a place in the queue at all. So in that situation, it will just omit responding to that particular message, and because of that, there is this omission failure. Okay, and because of this omission failure, there is an impact. So it's very tough to debug, because if you see, for most of the messages there is a response, but for occasionally some messages it is not responding, because at that point the load had increased or the system functioning had slowed down. Because of that, this happened. Is something which is very tough to debug. Okay, so those are omission kinds of faults. The fourth kinds of faults are the worst, actually, which are called as Byzantine or totally arbitrary faults. So a component, a node in the distributed system might encounter this Byzantine fault, where it might just fail in any way. That is, the node might just crash, might have a fail stop, might omit responding to certain messages, and what is worse is it might actually corrupt certain messages. So it might maliciously alter the messages to some other values or some other content, and which confuses the rest of the system. Okay, extremely tough kind of a fault to handle, and this is one of the algorithms, a classic algorithms to handle these Byzantine faults is this Byzantine agreement algorithms, which are extremely tough to design. Okay, a question obviously arises: how can we have these kinds of arbitrary nodes failing arbitrarily or having Byzantine faults? Well, typically it happens using a security attack. Let's say one of the nodes is compromised, and because of a security attack that has been launched at that node, and it is sending messages, it is corrupting messages. Let's say the message which was received to it was, let's say, debit 100 rupees from certain account. It corrupts the message, and instead of saying that 100, it says 1000, and rest 900 rupees are actually transferred to a hidden unknown account, which obviously belong to the person who launched the security. Because of these kinds of failures, the system functioning has to be very carefully designed, such that these faults also can be tolerated. An extremely tough fault to tolerate. We will not be discussing this in this particular. The fifth kind of a failure is this timing failure. So that where some timing constraints are violated by some of the components. That is, let's assume that a particular component, when we send a message, it is supposed to respond to that message in, let's say, 1 millisecond. And because of various reasons, because of networks getting clogged, because of the processor on which this piece of code is functioning, that has heated up, and because of that heat, what hardware typically does is when a component heats up, they just reduce the frequency, because we know that the amount of heat dissipated is proportional to the square of the frequency. So if the frequency is reduced, then this heating problem is kind of addressed. And because we don't want the component to be heated up beyond a certain level, otherwise it will stop functioning at all. So if we reduce the frequency, then the piece of code that is running on that processor now will not have the same timing guarantees which it had got from the processor. And therefore it will violate timing constraints. So with that violation, is there an impact of that violation? If there is no impact, then it doesn't lead to a failure. But if there is an impact, then we have to account for that. Understand that this particular piece of code might exhibit a timing violation, and we therefore need to take that into account while we design this particular. Right. So these are various kinds of faults, and for all these kinds of faults, we need to design systems, both hardware and software, to tolerate those kinds. So what are the types of tolerance? Well, we could have what is called as a masking tolerance. So that is, irrespective of the fault that has happened, the system behaves as if, to the external world, the system behaves as if nothing has been hampered at all. So the system always behaves as per the specifications, even in the presence of faults. So it has masked all the faults in itself, and to the external world as if nothing has happened. Well, if you want to support masking type of fault tolerance, obviously there is a cost associated with this. And that's what we discussed. We maintain these hot standby servers, or to design pieces of code which are able to mask these failures itself is a cumbersome process. The second type of tolerance obviously is this non-masking tolerance, where some system specifications are violated in the presence of faults. Okay, however, the system behaves in a well-defined manner. So that is, it doesn't do anything bad. Maybe there is a drop in the performance, so there is a degraded performance, but nothing chaotic happens in the system. And that, to ensure this well-defined behavior is this entire issue about how to perform certain actions in an atomic fashion. If we have atomicity present in the system, and all of us know the definition of atomicity. So atomicity is the key thing to ensure a well-defined behavior. So therefore, we can have a non-masking failure still providing atomicity. So even in the presence of faults and failures, the atomicity of the system is supported or is honored. However, the system functioning might be degraded. So there is an impact to the external world. So they start feeling the difference. However, there is nothing bad that is happening. So these are the top types of fault tolerance. Well, I think I will take a pause for a couple of minutes here in case there are any questions which are raised, which are there by any of the audience. So please feel free to type in your question on the chat window. I am monitoring it. And if you feel, you can also unmute yourself and ask a question if such a facility is provided. So are there any questions so far for whatever we had discussed till now?
No, sir. From my side, all is clear.
Hello, I could not coherently listen.
Okay, sir. From my side, is all is clear. Thank you, sir. Thanks. This is a nice session.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Just waiting for others to put in. I hope people are looking at the chat window as well. Okay then. So if there are no questions, then let me just proceed with whatever that we were. So we were talking of various kinds of faults and fault tolerance mechanisms or fault tolerance ways. So masking and non-masking fault tolerance. So how do we build a fault tolerance system? Well, first thing that in order to build a fault tolerance system, we first need to specify what are the classes of faults that this system can tolerate. Okay, we had talked of various types of faults. So first thing is we cannot design an open-ended system that it will tolerate any kind of fault. Well, that would be extremely costly, and we cannot even, if we cannot even list down what are the types of faults that might happen, we might not be able to design the system at all. So what we typically have is, a priori, we state what are the kinds of faults that might be present in the system, and out of them, which kinds of faults are actually addressed by this particular system and in what way. So that is what we mean by fault model. The first is that thing that we need to state. So what is the fault model? What kind of faults are tolerated by our system? And then for each of those faults, what tolerance do we provide? That is, what is it that we ensure even in the presence of the fault? Okay, so that is something we will need to specify. And based on that, then we decide what kinds of algorithms go inside these components so that they are able to tolerate or the faults specified in the fault model. And whenever we want to provide fault tolerance, we obviously need some kind of redundancy. So typically, if we have hardware, that is, we want to tolerate faults which are there in the hardware, then we have these primary and backup servers, something which we have discussed. So let's say we want to we want to tolerate K failures. So that is, if we have a system, and if there are K failures or K nodes in the system that can crash, but still we have to provide that continued functioning of the system, then in that case we need to maintain at least K+1 servers. Okay, so that is what we mean by this bullet, that K+1 redundancy is required to tolerate K failures if we have hardware kind of fault. So if we have K+1 servers, then we know that at least one of them is functioning, even if the rest of the K failures have failed. Okay, and the functioning was kind of continued. All the messages that the external world was sending are now being received by this functioning server, and things keep on moving ahead. What about software faults? Well, how do we handle software faults? That's first thing that we need to understand. So let's say we have some piece of code running, and we know that for a certain input, let's say the input to it was a number 4, and if the number was 4, let's say the output should have been 16. Okay, let's say there is a piece of code. If the input is 4, the output should be 16. And in order to provide, redundancy, we have multiple copies of this software running at various nodes or on the same node as well. Okay, so all of these copies, if they receive 4, they should give out a result which is 16. But let's say due to some error, maybe corruption of the databases, missing out of certain messages, timing errors or whatever of that sort, let's say out of 3 such independent copies of the software running, one of them fails. Well, first of all, how do we understand that this particular software component has failed? Well, we don't know, because if you always knew that the output to 4 was 16, then the requirement of that software piece of code itself was not required. We could ourselves have said that if the input is 4, output should be 16. Until and unless an output is produced, we have to check on the output to understand that this is a component that is failed. And in order to do that, we need to have what is called as a tri-modular redundancy. That is, we run 3 pieces of code independently, and then if one of them is misbehaving, we know that because the other 2 will have a value which is 16. Let's say one of the pieces of code returns us a value which is 15, while other 2 are returning 16. Then we know that since both of them agree to a particular value, so they become the majority, and the one which is in the minority is something that is erroneous. Okay, so software faults are even more difficult to handle. We need this tri-modular redundancy in order to tolerate software faults. So if you want to tolerate k failures, we need to have 2k plus 1 redundancy. That is, if k is 1, so if I want to tolerate 1 failure, we should have 3 components running the same piece. So that is how we can handle software faults. The third kind of redundancy is in time. So time redundancy would be redo the same operation again. So which is typically the case, let's say whenever we send a message from one node to another, and let's say the message just could not be delivered because of variety of reasons. The worst case is the link, the entire link from this end to that end might itself have crashed, or a particular link might have multiple routers which are present in the way, and one of the routers has become overloaded, and therefore it dropped the message which I had sent. If that is the case, then the message will never be received by the receiver. In that case, what is the standard practice? Well, we wait for a timeout. That is, if we wait for a timeout where we expect an acknowledgement message from the receiver, and if the acknowledgement has not been received, then we kind of resend the same message. So we redo the operation. Therefore, what we have used is additional time to get the same functionality. Okay, so this redundancy is useful when we have certain kinds of faults which are transient, like the error in the router which has not stored the message which I had sent. It just has flushed out that message because it got overloaded. So that is kind of a transient error. Eventually, the router condition might improve. So next time when I send the same message, maybe that message is included by the router and therefore it is delivered to the receiver. The fourth kind of redundancy is called as information redundancy. So that is in many situations, suppose we wanted to send certain message, we not only send the message, we send some additional stuff just to understand that if my original message got corrupted, the original message can still be reconstructed by whatever additional stuff that is sent. So various examples are there. We have parity bits, which allow the the receiver to conclude that there was a corruption in the message somewhere. Or we could also have what are called as error correcting codes, where the receiver might tolerate certain bit errors and and get the correct version of that particular message by using certain techniques or algorithms. So these parity bits or error correcting codes is an additional information that we are sending you over and above the message that we have to send. So obviously, the more this additional information is, the better correcting thing can happen at the receiver. But obviously, we are overloading on the network because it now needs to carry messages which are larger, and therefore it will consume more bandwidth. So these are the forms of redundancies that are typically used in order to provide for fault tolerance. And various systems will use various forms of redundancy to tolerate different kinds of faults based on the fault model. Right. And then final thing before we delve into the topic which I had to discuss is about some building blocks that are used in order to support fault tolerance. So these are some of the building blocks which are listed. First is we have to detect failures. If we do not detect a failure, we cannot act on it, right? And failure detection typically is done using heartbeat messages, which are exchanged periodically between various system components. And then there is a timeout associated with every heartbeat message. So if we miss out a message, that is a heartbeat message doesn't arrive within that timeout, then it's quite likely that the message has been lost. Or the system, the component has crashed. And it is impossible to differentiate between these two facts, that whether there is a link failure or a node has crashed is just impossible to understand in a distributed system. So typically, if we miss out a heartbeat message, we know that there is something wrong. What we might do is, use this time redundancy to wait for a certain amount of time to check whether the next heartbeat message might be received. If it is received, well, we feel that there was some kind of a transient error and we continue functioning, ignoring the fact that this error had happened. However, if we keep on missing these heartbeat messages, let's say 3 times, then we have to conclude that either the node has crashed or the link has failed. Why should we decide after missing of 3 heartbeat messages? Well, that's a decision that the designer has to take. So it's a design decision that how many heartbeat messages the designer is willing to miss out before the design, we conclude that there is a link crash or there is a failure of it. Okay, so that is how typically we do this failure detection. Second thing, so let's say some node detects a failure of some other node. Let's say there were 2 nodes, N1 and N2, and N1 has detected that N2 has failed. Okay, and how did it detect it? Well, using a heartbeat message. So there were, 3 heartbeat messages which N1 did not receive from N2, and N1 now concludes that N2 has failed. Well, N1 has the responsibility now to inform about the failure of N2 to rest of the nodes which are present in the system. So if then rest of the nodes know, then they will be able to act on that particular failure and then, try to do something about it. So how is that notification? That is notifying other nodes in the system of a failure which has happened. And that is typically done by algorithms which are very similar to gossiping that we all humans are used to. So there, in typical gossiping algorithms, what happens is a node N1 will inform about failure of node N2 to its neighbors. And these neighbors will then send it to their neighbors and so on and so forth. So eventually all the nodes in the system will understand that this node N2 has failed. Then they will try to account for the failure in some way. Okay, so that's the second building block about notification of. The third building block we need to have is reliable storage. Many times, whenever we have these algorithms where some data is to be stored in some data structure or a table in a database and things like that, we of course want that the state of the system is preserved even if there are failures. That is, nodes might crash, processes on nodes might crash, links might fail, but however, this data, which is the key, that remains intact. Okay, that is to be supported using various techniques, like we have this redundant array of inexpensive disks, this RAID, which ensures that at least we have some guarantee from the storage system that some faults can be tolerated by the systems. Or we could have network storage. So that is, instead of storing whatever data which we have on one single server, we broadcast or multicast that data to multiple servers and request all these servers to store that data. Therefore, if one of them crashes, we at least have a copy of that at some other servers. Okay, so all of us know about Google file system, etc. So every write which we make to a file written to a Google over an email or whatever, we send it to the Google servers, it actually gets replicated at least 3 times. That is at 3 different servers, and that too they make it a point that the servers are not located on the same rack. So we have the first copy going to one of the servers, the second copy goes to a server which is on the same rack, and the third copy goes to a server which is very far away. So even if the entire rack grows, we at least have some other place where this particular data is kept. So we need some reliable storage mechanism in order to support fault. The fourth thing is fault recovery, and that is what I will be discussing now. So here is, what if a system that had a fault and there was a failure of the system because of the fault, and so we take it out, we kind of recover or repair that system, and now this repaired system now needs to be integrated with the rest of the system. So can the integration happen just like that? Can we introduce the system back into this particular node, back into the entire system as such? Well, we need to see what things are required in order for this recovery to take place. That is, a node which had failed, had crashed, was repaired, and now it needs to be included into the system back. What needs to be performed is the topic of discussion about fault recovery. The fifth thing that has been written is about enforcing atomic actions across nodes. And that is the thing which I had mentioned about this well-defined behavior. So in order to have well-defined behavior, we need to enforce atomicity, which says that nothing bad happens. Either everything happens together or nothing happens at all. Okay, which is very, extremely important, mainly in the financial domain. Let's say we are talking of financial transactions. There was some debit which happened in account of person X, and there was supposed to be a credit which happens at account of Y. Now it must be the case that either this entire transaction goes ahead, so this debit and credit happen together, or none of it happens. So it should not happen that debit did not happen and a credit happened, or a credit did not happen and a debit happened. So in both of these situations, we are leading into a state that is erroneous, and it is extremely tough to find this out. So if we have atomicity ensured by the algorithms themselves in a designed manner, then we can actually enforce this atomicity, and therefore the system will behave in a well-defined manner. So how to ensure atomicity in the presence of faults is another topic which is worth discussing, but we will not be discussing it in this stage. The sixth thing is about reliable communication. So we know that links might fail, links might be lossy, network links might deliver messages out of order and things of all sorts. But we still expect that the communication should be reliable. So we want reliable unicast or reliable multicast or reliable broadcast. So in order to support this reliability, we need to use various things about replication. So we have to replicate in time. We have to replicate in information content, that is have redundancy in information to account for message losses or message corruptions. We need to implement something which is like the sliding window protocol to ensure that there is reliable communication between two parties. So essentially TCP is running. To ensure reliable multicast, there are various protocols. One of the main things with multicast or broadcast is that the order in which these messages are received by all the nodes should be the same. So which means that the multicast or broadcast must itself be atomic. So how do we have atomic multicast or broadcast is something which is related to providing reliable communication. And there are different algorithms to support all these factors. The final kind of building block is to provide what is called as an agreement or consensus. And this is the thing that needs to be provided for handling mainly the software faults, which are which might be present in the system because of a Byzantine behavior of some of the nodes which are present. So to provide for these kinds of tolerance of these faults, we need to run agreement or consensus algorithms at various nodes, which are extremely tough to. So various kinds of agreement protocols are there, and we would not be getting time to discuss about those agreement protocols in this. So again, I would take a break for a couple of minutes, so you can write your questions in the chat window or unmute yourself if you have any questions related to whatever has been discussed.
So any questions from participant side? Please ask.
Okay, so it seems there are no questions, and as always, I'm an optimist. So if there are no questions, I assume that everything that has been discussed is understood and clear to everybody. So let me proceed. Right, and then let me come to this main topic which I have to discuss, and that is about recovery after default repair. So as we had said that there are multiple system components. One of the system component encountered a fault. Because of that, there was a failure. Because of the failure which was understood, the system functioning continued because we had that replicated servers or things like that. So the external world was not hampered, or they didn't notice this particular failure. But internally, the system administrators understood that there was a fault and something had failed. So they take out the failed component and then they try to repair it. So once it is repaired, now they want to integrate it with the rest of the system. So that is what we mean by recovery as we have now. So recovery means restoring the system to its normal operational state after a fault. Okay. So it typically involves resource reclaiming. That is, when the fault, after the fault had occurred, maybe there were some resources which were taken up by the processes that were running in the faulty nodes. So those resources have to be reclaimed so that the backup server can continue its function. Resources here, we would not use typically the hardware resources, but something like a lock. A lock is a resource. So a lock would mean, let's say, some table of the database has been locked by the primary server, and now the primary server has crashed, and therefore the secondary server now needs to start functioning. So it first needs to reclaim that resource. That is the lock which was acquired by the primary server. Now it is to be acquired by the secondary server so that it can continue writing into the table which was locked. So that is sort of resource reclaiming which needs to. Second thing that might be required is undoing certain operations. So let's say we are talking of the primary server executing code which was for a transaction that was running at that point of time. And let's say the transaction was, again, the same example which I gave. That is, some money was to be debited from an account of X and it was to be credited into account of Y. Let's say the failure happened at the point where this debit from account of X had taken place and the system crashed. And before the primary system or the secondary system could take over, this transaction got timed out. That is, we could not actually do the credit into the receiver's account. If that happens, then after the system recovers, or even if the standby system takes up, it should understand that there was an operation which could not be completed, and so whatever was done partially needs to be undone. Okay, therefore, the money which was debited and not credited has to be debited back to the account of the person X. So this undoing of operation also needs to be done whenever, in some situations, wherever we have recovery of faults. And I'm sure many of us would have, have come across experienced this particular failure. That is, we typically make a transaction over the online banking system, and we made the transaction, and suppose there was some message loss or some network problem in between, the transaction could not be completed. And then typically all these financial servers will tell that if a transaction doesn't complete, do not redo it, wait for a couple of days, and then the money that was erroneously debited would be credited back to the account. So that is this recovery action that has to take place. And somehow we need to understand that this transaction failed in between, and therefore some part of the transaction has to be undone. Okay, so that is undoing certain operations. Fourth thing is, if a cooperating process fails, then the effects on other processes due to the interactions of the failed process need to be undone. So here, just to explain this, let's say there are, 3 processes which are cooperating with each other to perform certain functionality. And they cooperate based on either messages or writing into some shared location. And then let's say one of the process fails. If that happens, then because of the fact that it did not send some messages or it did not update any kind of shared memory, there is an effect of that on rest of the processes because all of them are cooperating to perform certain action. Okay, so because of that, the other processes cannot continue their normal operation. And they now need to, undo the interactions which had happened with the failed process and start all over again after the failed process recovers, or these two processes themselves try to keep on providing the functionality, assuming that the third process has failed. So they just kind of need to account for the failure of the third process. So that's the fourth thing. Fifth thing is that in a replicated system, if a node having a replica fails, its data might become stale. And when it comes back, this particular data needs to be made consistent. So let's say when a node crashed, it was, let's say, the primary node, and when it crashed, the data that was updated after it's crashed, that update happened at the backup server, because that now took over its function. So when the backup server updates any data, it happens locally. When the node, the original primary server has to be integrated back, it should get consistent data. So whatever data that it was supposed to be updated into the node that has now come up, it needs to get those updates. Therefore, it's now the data now becomes consistent with the backup server, and now it can get integrated with the rest of the system. So there are multiple issues that need to be done if once there is a recovery from a fault out. Right. So let's discuss this further. So we can have two different techniques of error recovery. One is called as a forward error recovery. So that is if the nature of errors caused by faults can be completely and accurately assessed a priori, then the errors can be removed and the system can keep on functioning as if nothing had happened. So that is something similar to what we discussed about an error correcting code. That if the receiver understands that there was an error, and then it is able to correct that error, then it can simply ignore that the fact that there was even an error that had happened. So therefore, the functioning of the system can continue as before, and this is called as forward error. Of course, there is much less overhead with respect to forward error recovery, because we don't need to undo any operation or any of that sort, as we had discussed in the previous slide. However, there is a cost that is about this information redundancy that needs to be. And what's more striking is that forward error recovery is not always possible. So only in situations where we have error correcting codes or things like that, that is essentially information redundancy, we can provide forward error recovery, but it is not applicable in general. What is applicable in general is the second technique, which is called as backward error. So here, if it is not possible to remove all errors in the system state, then we want to restore the system state to a previous state which was known to be error-free. That is called as backward error recovery. So let's say there was a crash, a node which got crashed. Because of that crash, the state of the node is now incorrect. So what we will need to do is we have to take or unroll back the state of that particular node to a particular state which was known to be error-free. And then we can continue the functioning of this particular node from that point on. So this kind of technique is more general. Okay, because it can be applied in various situations, in all the situations, in fact. However, there is a performance penalty, because now we are rolling back the system to a previous state. Whichever operations that were done from that state onwards have to be repeated. Okay, so there is this performance penalty, and the system is kind of stalled during the time that it is undergoing this recovery process. And there is no guarantee that the fault might not occur again. So if it occurs again in the next step, then probably we need to do this recovery multiple times and face this performance penalty all the times. And there might be certain difficult situations where the system components might simply not be recoverable at all. Consider a situation which is, let's say, a person goes to an ATM teller machine and it instructs the machine to withdraw 1,000 rupees from his account. Okay, so he gives that instructions and the system malfunctions. That is, it instead of taking that amount to be 1,000, let's say it by an error, it actually dispenses out 1,500. Okay, if had it been less than 1,000, all of us know that the user would have cribbed and would have stated that less money got dispensed from the machine. But in most situations, if we see that more money is actually dispensed from the machine, the user will happily take away and ignore the fact that there was an error. Okay, and such a failure is not recoverable. Okay, so in cases where we have these kinds of situations that we cannot recover from the failures that had happened, well, we cannot use backward error recovery in that case. So those are some issues, but typically most often what we will be using is this backward error recovery technique, because forward error recovery can be done in a very limited context. So let's see how backward error recovery can be done in a centralized system. So in a centralized system, what we do is we establish recovery points. So those are the points where we know that the system did not encounter any failures. So it's a system state to which the system can now be restored because there was no failure that had happened. Okay, so these periodic recovery points are established. And how do we establish a recovery point? Well, the entire information that was present in the system at that point now needs to be stored in some stable storage. And we assume that the stable storage survives the system crash. Whatever data that goes into the stable storage, it remains there even if the node had crashed. So such a recovery point needs to be established. So in order to do that, all active processes and their modified and the data which they modified has that data needs to be stored into this stable storage. And once a recovery point has been established, and let's say a failure does happen, we are talking of a centralized system, so there is just one node present here. Well, we can resume the functioning of the system from the recovery point that was already established because it was stored into the stable. Okay, so that's what can happen. So then the system has to resume its functioning from that. So we assume that there is this stable storage that is existing. And we also assume that the secondary data, the data on the secondary storage, that is on the disks, in any files which are present, that is also archived periodically whenever this recovery point is established into the stable storage. So the disk might crash, but the stable storage which we might have, it does not encounter a crash, even if the node might itself crash. And of course, the data from the main memory is flushed to the secondary memory using some paging scheme, and the secondary memory data is also archived periodically into the stable storage such that this recovery point has been established for the entire system. So this is the state-based approach. Again, I'm talking of a centralized system. So there is only one node present in the system. So the complete state of the process is saved in stable storage whenever a recovery point is established, and that is called as this checkpointing operation, which of course is costly because we have to write onto the stable storage And we know writing onto an external device is, let's say, around 1,000 times slower than writing into memory. However, that's the cost we have to pay if we have to support fault tolerance. And then recovering a process will involve reinstating that process to its same state, okay, which is called as a process rollback. And then from that point onwards, we resume the execution of the process from the state that was stored onto the state. This entire activity is called as process rollback. And we want that the rollback should happen to the most recent state, because then the amount of actions that have to be redone is kind of less. Okay, so we obviously want that, at periodic intervals, or we take these checkpoints so that if a failure happens, the recovery can be done from the latest checkpoint. And if it is just a little time duration ahead earlier, then the amount of computation that needs to be redone is reduced. In centralized system, whenever we take a new checkpoint, the previous checkpoint that was present in the stable storage can be discarded, because we know that a new checkpoint has been established. So the system state, the current error-free system state is available in stable storage. So the previous one which was present can now be ignored, can be discarded. Okay, and with which what will happen is the amount of stable storage space that we use is kind of reduced. Okay, so that is something which we need to do when we talk of recovery from failures in the centralized system. Now let's turn our attention to distributed systems. So how we could have recovery in a distributed system? So first of all, we need to understand that in a distributed system, there are several processes, and all of them cooperate by exchanging messages, and they are providing the functionality of this entire function. So they accomplish this task. So there are these messages which happen. So in this situation, if one process fails and resumes execution from a recovery point, so assuming that we recover every process, and let's assume that one process is running on one node. So we regularly take a checkpoint of every process on the node, okay, in some kind of stable storage. So if a process fails and then it comes back and it resumes its execution from one of these recovery points, the effects of the process it had caused to other processes after establishing the recovery point have to be undone. So what might have happened is, after the recovery point which was established, the process might have sent some messages to other processes in the system. And because of receipt of these messages, the other processes might have acted upon it and would have made some changes into their state. So now the fact that this process P1, which had established a recovery point and executed ahead, and it failed, it can resume its functioning from the recovery point which was established. But when it resumes its functioning, it resends the same messages, and that would have a different effect on the other processes which are present in the system. And therefore, these effects now need to be undone. Consider a case that the process had sent a message to debit 500 rupees from the account of somebody. And then it encountered a failure, and we didn't do any undoing operation. And when it recovers from the recovery point, it again performs the same action after the recovery point. And so it again instructs to debit 500 rupees more. So instead of just 500 rupees to be debited, we actually end up debiting 1000 rupees, which is incorrect state. So whatever had happened after the establishment of the recovery point and between the failure, those operations need to be undone whenever we establish a recovery. That is something we have to remember, and that is typical in a distributed system. This problem will not occur in a centralized system. And because of this, what might happen is that a process which was already active might also need to roll back to an earlier state to undo these effects. And we will see various examples of why such a thing might happen. And therefore, all the cooperating processes now need to establish a recovery point. It's not just the process which has failed that only recovers from its previous checkpoint. It's the case that all the processes might need to establish a recovery point. That is, they might also need to roll back to their previous checkpoints. Okay, even though they had not encountered a failure. That is something which is peculiar in a distributed system. So let's take an example of how this can happen. So in this slide, we have shown three processes X, Y, and Z. And let's say all of them are running on different nodes, N1, N2, and N3 respectively. Okay. And what we have shown by these square brackets are these checkpoints that are established by these nodes locally. That is in the stable storage which is present at the local node. Okay. And what we have shown by these directed arrows are some messages which are exchanged between nodes. So there is a message exchange between Z and node X. There is a message exchange between Y and node Z, node Y and node Z, and so on and so forth. And node X has established three recovery points, say X1, X2, and X3 at three different time instants. And node Y has established two recovery points, Y1 and Y2 at these time instants. And node Z also had established two recovery points, Z1 and Z2. So horizontally, we are showing the progression of time on all these three nodes. And then there are these various message exchanges which are happening in this particular time. Now, what we have shown in the green are various failures that can happen. So for the time being, let's assume that it is only node X which had failed. So just take a look at this green bubble only on the topmost line corresponding to node X. Let's ignore the failures of node Y and Z. Okay, so for the time being, let's only take that node X had failed. So if a node X failed here, and this failure is after the establishment of the recovery point, that is this checkpoint which was there in node X3. So when node X fails, it will obviously start from its previous checkpoint here. It starts from this point X3. And since after X3 it had not, and before the failure, it had not, node X had not sent any message to node Y or node Z, then node X can simply resume its functioning from this point X3 onwards. There is no impact on process Y or process Z. So that's the simple case. Now let's take a situation that node X did not fail. It's node Y which had failed. So let's take a look at this green bubble on the second line associated with Y and ignore these bubbles on node X and node Z. So if node Y fails, it can recover back to its previous checkpoint, which is this node Y2. Okay, and therefore when it recovers from that point Y2, it will resume its operation from that point on. But we understand that from this point Y2 till the point the node had failed, in between that there was this message M that was sent by this node Y, this process Y to this process Z. So if process Z would have processed this message and it has continued its function. So when node Y crashes or process Y crashes, it starts from this point Y2, it resumes its functioning, it will send this message M again to node X. Okay, and that would mean that the message M is received the second time by node X, so it will act on the message the second time, which it should not do, because it had already acted upon this particular message M earlier. So since this is a problem, so this is called as an orphan message. This message M is an orphan message because in the recorded checkpoint, the sending event of the message was lost, but the receiving event was already acted upon and it was present in the checkpoint of process X. So we have to understand that this M message has become orphan. That is, node X needs to understand that message M has become orphan, and therefore it cannot continue its functioning as such. It has to roll back to a state where it had not received this message. And that state is not this checkpoint X3, it is this checkpoint X2. So even though node X had not encountered a failure, it needs to roll back to node X2, to this checkpoint X2, because node Y had failed and it had sent a message. Okay, that is what I wanted to state, that the checkpointing or the recovery might involve rolling back of processes which had not encountered. Okay, now let's take the third case. That is, both the node X and Y are fine, so they did not encounter the failure. So we can ignore those green bubbles there. But let's take a look at this green bubble of node Z. So Z failed here. So because Z had failed, and when it comes back, it can start from its recovery point, that is Z2. So because it recovers from Z2, Y cannot continue its functioning. Y has to roll back because it had received this message which was sent by Z after establishing of Z2 checkpoint and before Z had crashed. So Y cannot continue functioning. It cannot continue from this point Y2 as well, because in the state Y2, the receipt of Z, this message has already been recorded. So it has to roll back further, and the place where it can roll back is this step Y1, the checkpoint Y1. And because Y had to roll back to Y1, okay, and because of the fact that Y had sent multiple messages to X from the point of Y1, X also needs to roll back. And it cannot roll back to X2 because it had received this message from Y. So it had to roll back to X1. So X has to roll back to X1, Y has to roll back to Y1. And because Y rolls back to Y1, Z cannot continue its functioning from Z2 because it had received this message which Y had sent to it. And that record of the receipt of the message is present in Z2. So Z has to roll back further to Z1, and they all of them, roll back to their initial checkpoints of X1, Y1, and Z1, which is called as the domino effect. So with one single failure, these multiple rollbacks are required to ensure consistency. These multiple processes, because of their rollback to their initial states, everything has to be started afresh. And this is called as the domino effect. And that is the difficulty in handling, this recovery in a distributed system as compared to recovery in a centralized system. And then there are various algorithms that need to take cognizance of this fact. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to discuss those algorithms here. We are already out of time. So unless there are any questions, I would pause my speaking and hand it over to the audience. So are there any questions?
So participants have any question, can you put into a chat window or simply ask to sir? So if there are no any questions, then it is the time to propose a vote of thanks. I would like to thank sir for accepted our invitation to deliver a talk in our faculty development program. Also, thanks to nicely presented insights into the fault tolerance in distributed systems, in which you have covered a classification of faults, types of tolerance, some building blocks, also covered topics on recovery after fault repair, and types of error recovery with a good example. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Dr. Dharmik, and it was really a pleasure interacting with everybody. So thanks a lot.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thanks to all the participants. And our next session will start at sharp 2 o'clock.